Meditations with Ryan Smolmak.
Today we get to talk about film. Not necessarily film as a storytelling device, though it comes up quite a bit in this conversation, but film as a medium. Film as something to shoot on. Film as a means of communication and a means of production. We're going to be talking with Phil Vigeant, who is the owner of Pro8mm, one of the premier Super 8mm film companies that focuses on film sales, film processing, scanning, and camera rentals and repair. They're based in Los Angeles. He has a fascinating history, starting in Massachusetts and then making his way to LA to sort of set up shop and continue. This is a really cool conversation about business. It's an interesting conversation about the backbone of the film industry, and is a great entry point for anybody who is interested in shooting their own film. If you're unfamiliar with the Super 8 film medium, we get into it a little bit, talking about Kodak sort of making a home video format and the way it's been utilized today. But it's a film format that was used very prominently in the 1980s with advertisements for Nike as well as music videos for MTV. It's used to sort of shoot archival footage, or things that look like archival footage in modern productions. And it's just a fun, accessible medium. You can go to a thrift store or search on Marketplace or eBay or something for old cameras and still be able to shoot your own film, which is really exciting. So let's hear from the person who is helping to make all this accessible to people. Without further ado, here is Phil Vigeant. Phil, I just want to say greetings from the East Coast. Thanks for joining us from the West Coast.
Uh-huh.
And you actually kicked off your professional life in Cambridge, Massachusetts, right? You started off on
Yep.
the East Coast.
Yep. I'm born and raised in Massachusetts, and studied accounting at Bentley College in Waltham, Massachusetts, which is where I got a part-time accounting job at this funky little company in Cambridge called Super8 Sound, which I, would have had no connection with other than it was posted on the board at school as, needing, so many hours of part-time bookkeeping. And so I decided to go down and check it out and take the gig. So that's really where I started into it. I had no particular interest in film or cinematography or 8mm other than the fact my dad had a camera and he always loved it, and it was always like a just sort of part of his universe. And he's a truck driver, and he ran a trucking firm, and so it's a sort of creative part of his existence. So it was always fun. He shot stuff. We would play with the projector and things like that, but just average thing that the average person in that era did.
Well, that's one thing I'm curious about is, so you're studying accounting in 1977. What got you thinking that accounting and business was the avenue you wanted to take?
At the time, I really was leaning much more towards engineering, but then there was kind of a crash in the economy in terms of engineers. It seemed like nobody was getting jobs, and back then, we were pretty focused on how can I get a better job, and the college thing was much more, training for the job and picking a college and a career that might make decent money, so that you could do well. So accounting, business, since I came from a self-employed family, just seemed like the best route for me personally to like make a sustainable living. So I kind of pitched the engineering and went for the accounting.
That's awesome. And just I was unaware that your dad was a truck driver and ran a truck firm. What were his sort of philosophies or approaches to running his business and running his side of things?
Well, he comes from a legacy of about 4 or 5 generations in trucking, starting, horse and buggy, with my great grandfather down through my grandfather. And the trucking firm used to be in the backyard of the house. The house was there and the trucks were, next door in the garage. and that evolved as a family business over a lot of decades. Into I always stayed a small little company. I worked with him, from the time I was a little person. I went to work with my dad when I was 5 years old, and helped out. And, I got on the payroll, I think probably when I was about eight, and just did odd jobs around, a small business. So I sort of had a sense of, what you needed to do to hold something like that together. Business talk was like common at the dinner table, and every time I'd jump in the truck with my dad, it'd be like, figuring out of how, they could save money or they could make money, or, whether they should expand, the trucks, farther down into Boston or something, or they should make airport runs, so I was really a part of that as a young person growing up. So I had a kind of a feel for it from my dad.
That's awesome. I like next time I drive on the 90 through Massachusetts, like I'm gonna be like, these streets are owned by the Vigeant family.
Well, you'll still see family trucks. I think it's called A&P Trucking now, but it used to be called AE Vigeant and Sons.
Interesting. And they still do shipping and logistics and all those kind of
Yep.
things.
Yeah, still do. My cousins wound up taking over the business, and it's I think it's a little smaller than it was when I was growing up, but they're all still involved.
That's so funny. So going from trucking to accounting to Super 8, so doing a little bit of research on this, you end up working for Super 8 Sound, which it started in 1971 in Cambridge, if I understand
Yeah,
correctly.
yeah,
And then you jump on board in 1977, kind of as just like a comfy college job, like as a thing to
yep,
sort of get your feet wet.
yep.
What were you doing for Super 8 Sound, and what was the culture of that company like when you joined them?
Well, they were in the boom time at that point because the whole, concept of using their thing was to create out of Super 8 a system that mimicked 35 and 16 millimeter professional photography processes, such that you could learn using a cheaper size film gauge, so that all the expenses of educating yourself on how to be and how to shoot film would be much less, because you were using less film, and you could access consumer kind of cameras. You didn't have to buy a 16 millimeter package in order to shoot. So they invented sync audio for Super 8 in the style of, in that era, regular 16 and 35 production. So anything that you would do in 35, you could imitate with the Super 8 Sounds sort of system with using Super 8. So they were selling to all the colleges across the country and other parts of the world. They were really on the boom when I worked there part time.
That's awesome. And just I just want to be mindful of listeners who are like, what on earth is the Super 8 thing? So it's, when you sort of describe Super 8 film to somebody and as just like its importance in the landscape of film development, how do you do that? Like, how do you describe Super 8 to somebody who's never experienced it before?
It's the smallest sort of multiple of film. So film goes out to 70 millimeters now in terms of size. And this is, because it's the smallest version, it's the most economic version. So it imitates the way film is used in the professional arena, but it's all been microtized so that the average person could experience it. So they could shoot, like a mini system, the way professionals would use it. So it makes motion picture making, accessible to anyone who wants to try it. And that was, the kind of the purpose of it, in the market, is a kind of a home system, to create home movies of things rather than just watching professional people's movies. So before everyone had access to that kind of technology, Super 8 was anybody who wanted to try, that this was the best avenue to go.
And when it came out, if I understand it, like it hit the market via Kodak in 1965 and became like I don't know, not only the sort of home video format before video, but also something that had that versatility where like young filmmakers could figure out how to make narrative films or documentaries or things like that. Um, in regards to the Super 8 sound when you were working for them and as they had figured out synchronization, just so I'm getting it, it's film and sound are still two separate entities. It's not a system where it's printing sound onto the film. It's something where you could coordinate it with another device and then
Right.
make sure that you could synchronize them later like you would with a 35 production.
Yeah, correct. Initially, there was no way of putting sound and film on the same medium. So coming up into this from and Super 8 actually stems off of 8mm, which was had many more independent people kind of trying to make films with 8mm, and there was a whole culture, sort of a subculture of filmmaking, kind of going on in the regular 8, and Super 8 sort of supercharged the whole thing. And Kodak, what they did really was they took something that was happening and it was growing, and they they jump started it, with a more sophisticated system, an easier way to use it, so that they expanded the market potential, so that everybody, once that product took off and everybody had one. I think it was probably one of the most successful consumer kind of tools, in that era. I think I had read one time 1 in 6 families had a Super 8 camera. So it took it from a handful of people who kind of wanted to make their own films and were mucking around with it, and to like everyone has to have this thing, in order to like, be an American.
Yeah, and I'm just trying to paint the picture a little bit more, but with regular 8 film, which I think came out in the 1930s, you've got a 16 millimeter roll that you have to keep in the dark and you film it, and it's kind of hard to handle. And then you have to go in the dark and flip it the other way to be able to get all your film, and then it has to go through a specific processing system and be cut in half. And like basically, Super 8 is you can go to Sears and you can buy the camera because every store is selling them, and then you can get your cartridge, you just pop it in, it's all self-contained. As soon as it's done, you have your 3 minutes of film done at 18 frames
Yep.
per second, you get it developed at your local store, and then boom, you've got home videos. Where it was the technical necessities, the skills that you would need seemed to really be removed from the process, so it was
Yes.
accessible to anybody.
Yeah, so that's really what Kodak did. The improvement in the images is is something, but it's not really that radical. It's really the system with which someone can use it, and they created a system where literally anyone can use the camera with and successfully capture a picture. So that changed the face of it and made it, yeah, enormously popular.
It's awesome. And so you're working for Super 8 Sound in 1977, and then if I understand correctly, like 1979 is about the point at which the bottom falls out of that market, video starts to enter.
Yeah. And we talked a little bit of sound. One of the one of the moves towards projecting this thing out even further for Kodak was to create a system where sound was recorded on the film. So they actually laminated an audio track on the side of the film, and they came out with a Super 8 Sound sort of system around 75. I think that's probably about the era. So that pushed it even further out into the world. But video had started to leach in to the world that we, embraced, and it was gaining some ground. It had won some battles in professional sectors and in various, because this is spread over a bunch of different markets. These things are all happening together, but they're all in different places, and it holds out longer in certain places based on some of the qualities that you're talking about. But home video cameras were pushing the envelope into that world. They were going from humongous things that you had to port on your shoulder to tiny, kind of cameras. And when they came out with 8mm video, they really condensed the whole process of video to make it much more palatable for the average person. And when you combine the no cost aspect of the tape and the fact that you could buy pre-recorded movies and play them at home, all of a sudden it just hit a certain point and people went, I went to the store to buy a new Super 8 camera and I came home with a digital video camera, like, and it just literally overnight went and dropped. I think they said 90% of their sales dropped in 1 year, in terms of Super 8. So like it didn't crash over like years. It crashed like one day. Like within a year's time, it went from the most popular thing you could have to something that nobody wanted.
Are you secretly a fireman? Because you decided to run back into that, Phil.
Yeah. Well, and exactly it. It was a great experience for me when I worked there. I loved it. It was you know, accounting can be kind of dry, and I was going for auditing and being a CPA, which means basically you go down to companies and everybody sort of hates the fact that you're there because you're there to sort of, tattletale on any, errors they're making, and you're going through their secret file, their books, it's a different kind of job than the job I had at Super 8 Sound, which was creative, intelligent people coming in with crazy ideas about the world that they wanted to document, and flying in from the Philippines because they're going to, set up a whole national film program in the Philippines with this system. And, so I left my job at Super 8 Sound, because it was my part-time little college job, and I went off and got a real big boy job. And then I was there for a couple years, and I was like, God, this is boring. And I loved like what life was like back in college when I was at Super 8 Sound, and all this interesting stuff was happening every day. People were coming, and it's like, God, I can't believe this. So it just so happened that a person that I work with at Super 8 Sound wound up kind of taking over the company, and they were in financial problems because obviously the market had crashed. And when that happens, companies, go through terrible change. And she remembered that I seemed to know something about accounting and called me up to come over and see if I could help in some way. And so I went back for like a visit, and I was, trying to give them a little advice on what they, and I had just graduated with a degree. And so there were some things that, you can do, you can file bankruptcy, and this way you can relieve some of the debt and still stay in business. So I wound up helping them file bankruptcy as a company, with my college professor, and, so, the things I had learned in college while maintaining my real job. But then slowly just got sort of sucked into the vortex of the whole thing, and started spending more time down at Super 8 Sound helping out and less time on my job. And finally, I just decided to take the plunge and give up the accounting career and full time go back and try to rescue Super 8 Sound from death.
What was the sort of moment at which you made the decision to purchase the company? You bought it in 1982, so there's about a 3-year span of the company just like limping along. Like, what was the
Yep.
spark that made you feel like this would be profitable and a good challenge for you?
It was a meeting actually at the bank of Harvard Community, one of the banks in Cambridge. And it was the guys who owned the company and the bank. The bank had lent them a bunch of money, and it was like, look, we gotta decide what to do with this thing, So they brought in the original founder who had borrowed the money. The bankers had their lawyers, and they, asked me to come because I was the guy on the, doing the actual thing. I'm trying to like run it for this guy and help this guy and all this stuff. And so we have this big meeting, and they're like, well, we need to just close this thing out, get rid of it. end the whole thing and walk away. And I said, you know, just in a moment of like sort of excitement of the, like when you're at the last stitch, is like, well, if you're just going to close it and stuff, can I have it? And can you just like give it to me? And then you guys all go away. The bank loan would go away, the owner would go away, everything would go, but this company would still be there and I would be able to like run it. And they were like, give us a minute. So they sent me out in the hall and they came back like 20 minutes later. They're like, okay, you can have it. It's yours. Free.
It's a good price.
Take it over. Like it's not worth anything. It's just sucking up air. It's just creating more debt. It's like, if you want it, you can go do it. So I like, cool. I just got myself a company.
What about that challenge really just excited you? Was it the idea of owning a company? Was it the fact that you knew that there was a collaborative component? Was it the engineering idea that you had this medium you needed to figure out? Like, what about it really called to you?
I think the idea that I could do it my way, because I had a bunch of ideas being there for like the 3 years, but most of that was answering to somebody else's desire to do it their way and to try to make that happen, and I was like, I don't know if this is the best way, and they would do stuff and I would be like, I don't know if I would do that, but they wanted to do it that way. And like I say, I came from, self-employed trucking, where you make every penny count, you do things completely strategically, you like, in order to make a buck in trucking, which is highly competitive, you've got to be good. And these guys, they had a great idea, and so they were mountains of money was pouring in at one time, but they didn't really have to be that strategic or that cost conscious or that, they didn't have to fight for every penny. So they didn't have that kind of appetite for that kind of stuff. So once I got rid of them, then I could run the thing like that, where things cost money, you charge money for them. You made an equitable kind of thing out of it, and it wasn't quite so much, of a playground anymore. But it sustained itself then.
What were some of the I just one of the things I really admire you about just a business owner is that like even before we started talking, you were already referencing your sort of reflective nature. Like, okay, cool. So the new year is coming and I'm going to be thinking about what worked, what didn't work, where should we change the business? But as soon as you got in there, like what were some of the changes that you implemented right from the get-go? And what was the bulk of your business in, at this point in 1982?
Well, most of the schools had gotten out of it. And actually, very fortunately for me, literally the next week after everyone left and I was out of their control, there was a sale we had kind of looming for almost 2 years in China for a school in Hong Kong. So it was the Hong Kong Film Academy or something like that. And they wanted to buy, like, I think it was 4 systems of it, and each system was everything that we sold times 4. So it was a sale, like at the time, that was about equal to 6 months of our normal sales. And so right at that moment, I get the letter of credit from the government saying, here's your order. All you have to do is deliver this thing and you'll get this check for $32,000. And I was like, yeah, I can do this. I can do this. So we spent day and night, like cobbing together pieces and parts and like, and we were able to build 4 systems and ship them and then collect on that sale that really, that covered us for the first 6 months. So it was sort of the last of that stuff, because we, those were systems where they had independent tape recorders with cameras. It was the old Super8 sound systems. And, that had been dropping off, all those years, the 3 years, like less and less every year. And I could see that that wasn't going to sustain. We had to find a new place to play. And it wasn't in sound recorders selling them to schools. So once we got the cash flow from that one last sale and basically cleaned out all the inventory we had, we could concentrate on the new stuff that was coming out, which was music videos.
Yeah, so there's this huge boom, courtesy of a little institution called MTV, right? You've got this
Right,
like all of a sudden music videos become popular and the aesthetic of Super 8 becomes really hot, right? Like you've got
right.
Paula Ab is it if I'm correct, Paula Abdul's music video for Straight Up
Yep,
is like
straight up.
yeah, directed by David Fincher, known for, Gone Girl and House of Cards and all those. Directs that music video. It's like the first music video that's shot entirely with Super 8.
Yep, big time stuff started to happen. But preceding that, there was a whole wave of, you have to remember, you've got a bunch of musicians who aren't used to seeing themselves, and they need creative people to make some creative thing with their music. And you have all these people that are going to film school who are all trying to get jobs as directors, and there's only like 10 jobs for directors, and somehow they're graduating 500,000 kids every year, to be directors. So it's a terrible inequity. So you have a huge army of people who learned about filmmaking, many with the Super 8 sound system, in film school, who are looking for something to do. And then you've got all these musicians who need something done. And so the two just naturally met together. And when the musician came to the film, and well, what do we do it on? Well, we do it on Super 8 because that's what they were learning in film school and all this kind of, right. So it made this giant welling up of like people, by the thousands creating music videos for everybody. And then as that started to rise up, then really, Hollywood people and people with, huge names in music started making their video and started seeing, that energy and pulling the best out of that mushroom cloud of creativity and applying it to their stuff. So then you had, then the whole public found out, that this was the way to do it.
And so this whole thing is happening, and obviously there's a big boom in business, and you're realigning. The thing I'm curious about is you just have this inherent like collaborative spirit. Like what was your role like in all of these interactions? Are you teaching people or reteaching people how to shoot on these things? Like what are you within the supply chain of this revolution of music videos?
Well, you've got the first guy comes in and he's like, "Hey, I'm going to do this thing," and you're like, "Oh, okay. Well, what are you looking for?" I need this camera and I need to do this. Okay, and we need to get that process. Okay, we can do that over here, and so I'm going to task for him trying to figure out how to put the elements needed for filmmaking together to make it all work, and then scheduling, and it's got to get done fast. And okay, so once you've done it for the first guy, then the next guy walks in, you're like going, "Oh, you want to do that? You go here, you go there, you go do this, nigga this." And so it's really, it's somebody else's idea. It's not my idea, but I'm in a position where I'm working with you, and now you've taught me what you needed, and I can apply that to somebody else. And then that somebody else gets to ride in on the fact that we already figured out where the best place to process black and white film is. And, there's no investigation needed for that part of it. We can go to the next level, and we can take it a little further. And so as you start to piece these things together, you start realizing, oh, everyone has to transfer film to video. Okay. So we're all using these, and I had invented them too, these projectors that have a special shutter and a screen, and you point a video camera at it. And it's like in motion pictures in Hollywood, they had already left that, couple decades ago, and started using a very sophisticated machine that you put the film on, and it's all designed so that you can control it and you can change things as you transfer it. And, they're 20 years ahead of this whole kind of technical curve. So I'm like, well, we got all these films we got to transfer. We need to talk to those guys with the professional machines, and we got to get them to get the thing that makes Super 8 work on that machine. So in the scanner, it's called a rank. The company actually made a Super 8 module to transfer Super 8 on their professional machine, but they didn't. They wanted like 30 grand for it, and no one company would be, saw the economics of having a $30,000 accessory for this machine to do the occasional maybe Super 8 job. So at first we talked them into renting it. So I said, hey, why don't you have one in LA and you can rent it to companies who want to do professional transfers. So we'd go and we'd rent it for the day, and then we do our transfers. And all of a sudden now you can take Super 8 off the hokey, projected on the wall system, so you can put it in the regular professional systems. Wow, that like blew people's minds, that. And then of course the quality of the Super 8 now done on a real machine was like, everyone's like, oh my, that's Super 8, how could that possibly be? Super 8 in my head is what that looks like in my living room on my little 8-inch screen that I project on with, the lights flickering, and, like that can't be Super 8. It can't be like that good, but it is. It just wasn't handled professionally. So we were able to build those kind of bridges. And that particular one with renting the gate, that took a lot of meetings and convincing these guys that this is a good idea, and caging somebody in a trade show and say, hey, did you ever think about, like renting this thing out? Oh, nobody will rent it. Oh, wait a minute, let you talk to this guy from this group. Okay, and he come, So my role in it is trying to put those things together, trying to piece together what the guys know that they want, but aren't really economically capable of putting them together because they're just looking at their one film job. And they're not looking at, oh, there's 10,000 people shooting this thing. What if all 10,000 wanted to use it? Now it's worth it.
Did you, and is that when you started to take like archiving in-house as opposed to, using other facilities for that? Or like, I guess I'm curious, like at this time, were you were selling film?
Yeah.
But like, and you obviously you'd moved to LA. I missed that part in the chronology. But
well, the MTV thing went so well from Boston that we were renting cameras and shipping film and processing into LA daily. And so we'd have 10 cameras like leaving Boston, going to LA, every week, and getting them back to Boston. And like, so it's like, well, if you're going to send all this stuff there and then bring it all back, it's like, what makes sense is like to go there where it's all kind of happening, and then they could just pick it up and you could process it right there. So it just seemed pretty logical. So he came out, tried to get people interested out here. They weren't. And then we're like, we could try to do it ourselves. That would mean moving. So, eventually we realized, yeah, that could work. We could move there, and this would cut out all that shipping. And, we'd be right there with all the people who were doing all the work.
That's awesome. What was the I guess like that was a big boom. It obviously brought you guys a lot of business. You were able to invest in all of these other components that had to be outsourced.
Right.
What was the what helped you after that movement? Like what kept your company afloat after the music video wave started to die down a little bit?
Well, we we had in around 91, there was a real big recession in the United States, right around the Gulf War. And the music video thing, like you say, was kind of curtailing its sort of thing. We had some other stuff. Music videos led to some commercials, but it wasn't like music video. And we were doing a lot of, starting to do some documentary stuff because there was a lot more documentary documentary recreates, started and stuff, but nothing was really, not like music videos. So at that time of the recession, Kodak started to peel back some of its offerings. They started discontinuing a lot of film stocks. And one thing they were going to discontinue was Ektachrome film, which was one of the main things we were using. Using Kodachrome and Ektachrome. Kodachrome for its qualities, and Ektachrome because we could process it in-house, deliver it fast. So a lot of jobs couldn't tolerate the cycle time of getting Kodachrome processed. So they had to shoot them on Ektachrome, schools and stuff like that. So Kodak's like, oh, we're going to get rid of this. We're like, like our lives are going to be.
Yeah, and if I can just interject real quick, Phil, just for those who are unfamiliar with the terms, Kodachrome and Ektachrome are sort of the two most popular, at least at the time, like color, and they were both reversal films, which means that you would get the film processed, and then instead of getting a negative, you would be able to instantly project that film, right, on your projector or get it transferred or whatever. And Kodachrome, notoriously one of the most beautiful film stocks in history, I still miss it today, had very specific places that could process it, and it was a multi-stage process that took a very long time, whereas Ektachrome, if I understand, was able to get processed much more quickly, and just had a different sort of color palette that you'd be able to get. So the idea of Kodak getting rid of Ektachrome meant that the only color stock would be extremely inefficient to get processed quickly. Does that sound right, Phil?
Yep, and low ASA, so it's 40 ASA, so you can only shoot it when you got a lot of light. So you'd have only something that you could do outside, and it would take a week or so to get it back. So when you're trying to pitch a commercial or even a music video, and you're telling them, well, you can't look at this thing for a week, it's tough, to tolerate for a professional kind of application. Amateurs can deal with that, but when you got a job and you got to wrap everything up and you're gonna have to wait a week to see if it came out, that doesn't fly very well in production. So if Kodak pulled the plug on the Ektachrome, it really would have put us in kind of a bad place. So we started thinking, maybe we could make the film ourselves. And so we had this equipment that we were making the Super8 Sound tape with, that took 35mm sound recording tape and punched the Super8 holes in it and slit it so that we could use it as the recording tape in the Super8 Sound era. So we're thinking, well, if we took that and we put it in the dark, we could take 35mm film and punch and slit and have our own Super8 film, but then we'd have to put it in a cartridge. And we didn't have, we asked Kodak for these, they were not interested. So this student showed up at my office in Boston from Lithuania with a Russian reloadable Super8 cartridge, because in Russia, they did it with a system where they'd ship you a spool of film and you'd have to load it in the cartridge yourself and then shoot it. But we were like, well, if we had these reloadable cartridges, we could punch our own film, we could put Ektachrome film in our own cartridges and do it. So we set that all up. And as we got going into it, we're like, oh, maybe we should do something even better than Ektachrome, because in professional filmmaking, everyone had migrated to shooting on color negative. And what color negative has going for it, it has not only the exposure range, which we got from the Ektachrome, but it has latitude in the images. So you didn't have to be as precise about the photography. You could get a great picture and not have the most perfect lighting, because the film absorbs much more range than the reversal films did. And not only would we get that, but it also processes, like you said, relatively easily compared to Kodachrome. So we could process it ourselves right away. So we would have something more flexible than Ektachrome. We could process it ourselves. And basically it had become the standard of all professional motion picture filmmaking, was to shoot it on color negative. We didn't had color negative in Super8, so we couldn't use what was the norm. So when we integrated Super 8 into productions, oftentimes we had to like keep reminding the people using it that you couldn't do the same things as they were doing with their 16 and 35 stock because it was reversal film, and they had to remind them that it had low latitude, and you had to constantly be making excuses for why the Super 8 wouldn't work. And if we had negative, we just say, "Oh, you shooting on 50D, then shoot 50D in Super 8." You just would all line up. So we're like, "Oh, this could really be good." So we set to task at actually making Super 8 color negative, and we took those Russian cartridges and we loaded some film, and we took the Ektachrome machine, which was now not being needed, and we made it into a color negative machine, and we started doing Super 8 color negative.
That's amazing. And I guess I had never thought about the idea that, you know, as if you're thinking about like a major film production and the idea that you need to be, we want to shoot on different films for different grains and things like that. Or sorry, film formats for different grains. And then all of a sudden you're like, all right, we can do this on 35, we can do this on 16, and you get to Super 8, and it's like you're in this desolate landscape of what films you can choose. If you
Yep.
aren't shooting the same film grain, or the same film type, it's something that really has to be creatively processed for a director to say, okay, well, the viewer will accept this alteration in color or look. Whereas if you're all of a sudden you're repurposing this 35 millimeter film stock, all of a sudden a director or whomever can just shoot that on Super 8, and the looks, despite the fact that the grain and the resolution changes, the
Right.
actual characteristics of the film remains the same.
Right. And it's the lighting. I mean, you're as a DP, you're lighting the thing for the film stock that you're shooting. And when they're using negative and you've got 7 or 8 stops of latitude, and you try to expose a roll of Kodachrome in that circumstance, it doesn't come out right at all. It has to all be relit properly. If the cinematographer really wanted to make something look good in Super 8, you'd have to relight the whole set to make the Kodachrome look good, because it's not designed with the right contrast, key to fills and all that stuff, for that kind of film stock. So it comes out looking crappy. But like you say, when you have the same stock, and then other things we realized only after we started doing it, things like education. Like say I had a DP shooting a major television series, be approached from Kodak with a new stock, but they didn't want to invest the kind of money it took to shoot a bunch of tests in 35 millimeter of whether Vision stock would look better than the other stock that they were using at the time. So the DP just got some Vision in Super 8 and made a little test on the set between the old EXR stock and the Vision stock, and we put the two up in Super 8, and it was so day and night in terms of how much improvement Kodak had made in the Vision stock over the EXR film. He was like, they switched the next day. So, being able to be enlightened in that way, because you have access to what it's really going to come out like in Super 8, became a really nice thing for cinematographers or, people who, had to make those kind of decisions. So we got other benefits out of it as well as we kept going. And we were going from Ektachrome at 160 ASA to 500T color negative, which essentially means, even though it's a stop and a half really between 160 and 500 of the stock, because the stock has latitude, it can take a picture about 4 or 5 stops deeper into darker situations. So now you can shoot in places you never even imagined you could shoot in Super 8, because with a 500T stock, you could go down 4 or 5 stops from where you used to be. So now you can take pictures all kinds of places where regular Super 8, you could never shoot in those environments. You were confined to certain things. So that opened things up a lot.
Yeah, so all of a sudden, if you want to do a night shoot, if you want to do something where you've got limited lighting and you can rely on shadows more or something like that, you're able to
Yep.
do it with this negative stock, and you never could have before.
Right. So it really did kind of open up the medium tremendously. Now it took a few years to kind of work out the kinks because it wasn't, initially designed that way. And we went through some huge things like the Russian cartridges, even though they were designed to be reused, they didn't reuse that well, because there's a little spring in there and the spring seems to wear down a little bit. And so after you used them a couple times, you'd start to have technical problems with the cartridges, and the precision with which those cartridges were made were nowhere near the precise nature of the Kodak cartridge. So eventually we did approach Kodak, and we had a really good Kodak rep at the time, and she made a case for us, and they allowed us to use their cartridge to load the color negative film. So that improved our technical sort of aspect of the whole thing dramatically. So there was a lot of things that had to happen to like perfect it, and that took 3-4 years of like working on it. But because it was so flexible, so capable, so new to people to be able to do things with this thing, that it that creative part carried it, through all kinds of stuff, and great music videos like Mozzie Stars, Fade Into You, it's like done on 500T, like it's we got some great projects, that came out of it.
That's amazing. And the other thing that it did is that it also involved you changing the name of your company, right?
Yeah, we figured the sound thing had kind of, we weren't really associated with that anymore. And we really wanted to, we called the film Pro8 film actually for a practical reason. We had a lot of schools still buying our film, and some schools were still projecting the film. And we didn't want people to confuse the fact that this film was negative and it couldn't be projected, because you have to take a negative film and you have to create a positive out of it somehow, which is done in the transfer process. But not all film was transferred at that time, and some people were still projecting, and we would get into all kinds of trouble with the schools that we supported if students just called up, oh, I want some film, and we sold them our film, and then they couldn't project it. So we renamed it. Instead of Super8 film, we called it Pro8 film, so that they would say, oh, okay, it's Pro8 film. It's different somehow from Super8 film. I don't know how, but I think I'll ask. And then most of the time someone would ask and you're like, oh, you can't project it. Oh, okay, I get it now, right? Because the power of it, when they call, they're like, oh, I'm going to shoot this party in this, cellar, like, well, you want 500T. But then, we wouldn't always know to ask, well, are you projecting this? So by changing the name, we kind of put a question mark in people's heads when they bought it to figure out what Pro8 meant, rather than just Super8, so that they wouldn't make the mistake of like buying a bunch of film and then realizing, oh, I can't project this film, and then you get into that whole problem.
Well, it also levels up the language that you're using. So when people have to make the sales pitch of, oh, I want to shoot this sequence in Super8 for this Nike commercial or whatever, you can be like, well, this is actually Pro8mm film. This is the professional version.
Right. So, and then they like, oh, what does that mean? And then you would be like, and some of that nuance matters to people, because if they're trying to get an exact simulation of like what it was, like they want that Kodachrome look, they're really better off shooting in Kodachrome or an Ektachrome to kind of get that, if they want it to look exactly like that. If it's supposed to be a perfect period match. And initially that was they were much more sensitive to that. But now, as we're like way past, people understanding that stuff in the digital era, they don't know the difference. So if the sprocket holes show up black, because, when you transfer a piece of negative film, the sprocket hole is going to be black rather than white because it's reversed. They don't seem to be bothered by that anymore, where in the old days it was like, oh, what's wrong with that? Something's off. It doesn't have a white sprocket, or so today it's film, that minutia is lost on people, and they accept Super 8 negative film now as the norm of recreated Super 8, or and that's a big part of the market for it today. Is oh, I want something to look like old film. We'll do it in Super 8, and for a long time, professional people wouldn't move past 16 millimeter. They needed, that level of confidence in the film medium. But today, with most people doing digital, Super 8 can substitute for 16 millimeter just as easily as shooting it on 16 millimeter. So anytime the idea of, oh, it's going to be recreated looking footage, Super 8's like number one on the choice list, for people to use.
That's amazing. I wanna come back to the sort of modern era and the professional stuff that you're working with, because it's really interesting. But I want to go take a step back, because you talk about a lot in your book. But the archiving of Super 8 films is I don't know how much of a part of your business it is, but it's been a very important part of your tale. And in your book, you talk about just having the privilege of all of these filmmakers, Steven Spielberg, Sam Raimi, J.J. Abrams, whomever, who started off making Super 8 films, and being the person who is entrusted to transfer those to an archival medium, in this case, a digital file that allows them to have that in the future. And I'm just curious, like, about, obviously in the music video era, you have to start converting everything to video because it's going to end up being televised or whatever later on. But when did that start? Like, when did you start to get recognized by filmmakers as the person to go to get these transfers done?
Well, after we, talked the rent guys into renting that gate for their scanner, eventually we realized that we had enough so that we could get the scanner ourselves, and we could buy a scanner and we could dedicate it to 8 millimeter, rather than when you rented the gate for the Super 8 component and you were primarily a 16 or 35 millimeter shop, you had to kind of customize your machine a little bit to accommodate the little quirks and problems of 8 millimeter film, because it's small and the way it's spliced together, and everything has its own kind of nuances to it. And so if you're doing 16 all day long and all week long, and you come and you have to do this Super 8 job, it's almost like what you're doing, but it's not all like what you're doing. You're not used to the nuance of it, So you'd take Super 8 to a major facility and a splice would break, and you're paying $500 an hour to use this room, and nothing's happening for 20 minutes. Get the courage up to go in the back room, find out what's going on. There's 8 guys sitting around trying to make a splice in a piece of Super 8 film, because they're just not proficient with it. It isn't quite the same, and they don't have the tools, and they could do the scanning part, but they didn't have the backup to deal with the medium as a unique medium. So we decided to buy one of the scanners ourselves, start doing the scanning ourselves. And then once we had it, then we really customized it so that it would be the ultimate Super 8 scanner. We want the Super 8 thing to be like the best Super 8 it could be. So that meant changing tensions in the machines and doing things that would make it customized for Super 8, rather than a 16 or 35 machine that you just used occasionally for Super 8. So as clients started showing up, like Spielberg, who wanted to see what the best could do, and then pushing you forward, the one aspect of those kind of clients are they have a higher sense of taste of these things, and so they like, hey, couldn't you do this? Or what would it cost to do that? And with normal customers, it's usually, oh my God, that's way too expensive. I don't want to spend that on this. But with those kind of customers, it's like, oh, they have the resources, so that if it can get a little better, they're interested in that. And so it pushes you to buy $40,000 accessories that just do stabilization in the picture. It's like $40,000 piece of thing that just makes the picture a little bit more stable. It seems unreasonable, but for that kind of client, some of those things and exploring the technology is much more what they're doing with it. They want to see what's there in the state of the art. So they're pushing you to like come up with it. We had the first HD scanning of Super 8 film. Like we're the first ones who could do that, and people like, my God, what's it going to look like in HD? Like, what's film resolution going to be like in HD? So, yes, it's their home movies, but also they're like all filmmakers. They're using all these experiences in their process. So maybe they're learning something about, and a lot of them were learning about modern scan technology, because it hadn't come to it for them yet. They're still working in film. They're still right. And so they take their home movies, they scan it at the best place. They start to see how there's relationships between, the resolutions of standard def and high def and, the different file types. And so they use that learning in their process, and they probably, then go back and start thinking, well, maybe we're not going to cut on film. We're going to scan it and post it digital. It moves their process as well. So once you're identified as having the most cutting edge kind of thing, then these people seek you out, and it's a great part of the experience to be able to like be in those shoes, to be, I call it top dog, like the guy who's got the top kind of thing to do this kind of thing, and they want to see, how it can work on their stuff. And that stretches from filmmakers to like, I remember doing L. Ron Hubbard's, like home movies, and like all these kind of, right, and they're all very serious about their images, and you're able to seriously pursue it with them.
It's interesting just in the sense that like in your book, it also gave you this like really interesting insight into the growth of these different filmmakers too. Like one of my favorite quotes is just, no one starts out great.
Yeah.
And no matter whom you're transferring, you're seeing, like, I think I've heard you say quotes along the lines of, if you were to take all these amazing filmmakers that we're used to, that are making billions of dollars at the box office, and you put their Super 8 films in line with just an average film school student, you can't really typically pick out who is going to be successful and great in the long term.
You cannot, not at all. It's kind of crazy that way, right? It is
Absolutely.
great insight to see that development and to experience it. If you do their archive, you get it from start to finish. So you start with their first projects, and then they progress chronologically as you're scanning them, and then you start to see where things are starting to happen, where their mind is starting to connect with what's going on in the pictures, such that it's powerful in its imagery. And it's like, oh, it's clear they didn't get it with the first movie, but this fourth movie, yeah, parts of this movie, you're really starting to suspend your disbelief, when your mind jumps into the picture and it's like there, right, rather than you're just watching it. It's like, wow, he's got me there now. I remember doing Sam Raimi's Within the Woods. Like, wow, that was probably the greatest Super 8 film I've ever seen. Just scared the pants off of us.
Yeah, and what did you? It was I was actually just reading about it yesterday, but what did you say? It was like 10 years of films that you transferred. You did it over the course of 3 days, and you just like took it all in. And by the time you got to Within the Woods, you're like, this is legitimately scary.
Yeah, this guy's got it. He's going places.
That's amazing. Did you have other experiences like that with other filmmakers, or had most of them kind of moved on to other mediums by the time that they started to get better?
I'm trying to think of like Steven Soderbergh's films. Yeah, with Spielberg's films. They're good films, you know. But yeah, I think they mostly had moved on to other mediums by the time, there's a greater gap between their Super 8 films and their big time budget films. Although strangely, some of Spielberg's most famous films are really remakes of films that he had already made before. Like he obviously loved the ideas in like Saving Private Ryan and E.T. and that he has Super 8 film, or they're 8mm films actually, that are very similar in nature to those films. And Close Encounters, I'm sorry. And you can see the elements of them in the big budget, and it's almost as if he took those ideas that he only had the economic whereabouts to make them so grand at that scale of 8mm, and he just went crazy and made them, big epic kinds of versions of the same thing.
I firmly believe that the themes and the things we're passionate about when we're young follow us whether or not we want them to.
Yeah,
And it's really, I mean, just with you sort of with that engineering financial mindset that you're constantly applying to Super 8, Spielberg's, looking at these different themes of where we are in the universe or how we connect with the greater
yeah,
universe, or what it means to be with people in times of turmoil, like follow him,
yeah.
40 years later, which is pretty neat. And speaking of which, we're now in this era of Pro 8mm and Super 8mm where it's I won't say that it necessarily lost its qualities because, or it lost its popularity, because one of the things just as film viewers is that oftentimes we'll watch movies with Super 8 segments and never even acknowledge that they're Super 8 segments.
In fact, that was there was a a huge boom in our marketing really happened recently when the concept of using the sprocket hole in the frame in the final started to gain popularity. And initially, that had nothing to do with that. When the technology of stabilization digitally started coming in, filmmakers were asking us to overscan the image so that they could see the sprocket, so that they could use the stabilization software to use the sprocket to stabilize the picture. And so we're in this whole like technical kind of round of like, we can improve the look of the film by stabilizing the picture. But to do that, we have to overscan the image in order to do the stabilization. And then somewhere along the way, one person, many people, I don't know what happened, but someone decided they were going to use the sprocket holes in the picture as the end footage. They never framed it up. They used the sprocket and the frame line and stuff in the actual product. And I don't know. The first time I saw it, I thought, oh, this looks stupid. This is just, it looks crappy. You got the jaggedy edge of the frame, and you got this sprocket blinking at you. And I was like, this doesn't make any sense. And I'm like, why are you doing it? But one person after another started doing it that way, and before you know it, it caught on as a pop fad culture thing that you see the sprocket hole with the picture. And the consequence of that in our marketing was all of a sudden, where, like you say, people didn't identify with the fact they were looking at Super 8. There it was. The evidence is like it was signed, like a signed photograph now, that this is actually Super 8 you're looking at. And even myself, sometimes I'll see a frame or a shot, like in that Winning Times program that recently came out. So, I'm watching this like, that's Super 8. That's, and trying to figure it out. And without that sprocket reference, sometimes they can fool you. And even they went so far as to do sync sound scenes, which you like never see, right? Super 8 done with sync sounds. So they've got a whole dialogue sequence going on in a major television multi-million-dollar production. And you see the sprocket holes come out. You're like, oh, that whole thing was just done in Super 8. No one would ever imagine that something like that has been done, in that kind of screen size. So the sprocket hole reference has become like a major promo scheme for us because people now know when they see it, they're like, oh, that's Super 8. And fortunately for us, they often go, oh yeah, that probably came from Pro8mm. So it, like we get a double wham out of every time that sprocket shows up, even if we didn't do it.
It's super cool. And like, I was thinking, I was just kind of referencing filmmakers like Scott Derrickson, who did like Sinister and The Black Phone, where like, Super 8 is literally a prominent part of a plot line in Sinister. And then in Black Phone, these sort of dreamy sequences are shot in Super 8. And then looking at Winning Time, for anybody who's unfamiliar, it's an HBO show about the Lakers, sports ball, basketball. And as you're watching that show, you'll notice that the quality of the image constantly is changing based off of what medium they're shooting on for that particular scene. It's just such an accomplishment. I've never seen a show that manages to capture the aesthetic look of an era better than that
Yes.
show.
Yeah.
And for you guys, it was one of your biggest projects you've ever had. Like, what was it? 1,200 feet of film. For people who are kind of unfamiliar with what that means, it's about 4.5 hours of Super 8 footage. Is that correct?
No, it's a
Oh,
lot. It was like 1,500 rolls.
1,500 rolls. Oh, because they're 50-foot rolls. They're not 100.
Right.
My math was off. Sorry. Okay.
So it's 40 or 50 or 60 hours worth of Super 8 film.
Yeah.
It's a lot. They did a lot of shooting.
Over the course of 2 seasons, because I think the show got canceled after the second one, right?
Yeah, yeah, because HBO got bought out recently, so that
Yeah.
bought that
What was
quantity.
it what was it like working with those cinematographers? Because you clearly, you've done some interviews with them. You clearly have some really just great rapport with them. I mean, and the other thing is the cinematographers are around my age. I mean, they're in their late 30s, early 40s. They're not people who grew up shooting Super 8 films for family events. They grew up shooting them in film school. So what was it like working with that team to kind of get them ready to implement that amount of Super 8 into their TV show?
I'm sure they never thought that they would do that, as is with so many of these things. Someone will do something during production, and the creative types, see it in the dailies and like, oh my God, I love that. I love the way that works. And the editors like, oh, give me more of that. And then it feeds back to the production team. And that's these things kind of develop on their own. So sometimes it lays a turd. They rent the equipment and they never even use a frame. They decide against it, and then other times it just grows on them, and they realize, oh, this is really, I feel, connecting us with the era, or what they're trying to accomplish. And then they start using it more fluidly, and then they start to explore it, and go out, like I say, into areas like sync sound, which, so rare to see somebody, take it that far. But they don't start out there. They usually just start out with some clips, and then, for the trailer, and then sometimes it grows into the show itself. And sometimes, like with this project, it just grows incredibly in terms of having, there's one of the basketball games in the first season that's just mostly Super 8. The entire game, and the photography of the game is really kind of unique in the way that it's not like a bunch of steady cam and Luma cranes, like hovering over these guys playing basketball. It really feels like the camera's on the court, and you're doing something in, they're not even looking at the viewfinder. They're using the camera, and the feeling of that footage sometimes is so intimate, like the sweat is falling onto the lens, kind of thing. That when you get it right, it really feels like you're in there. You're in the game itself. So I think it just grew into that. I don't know that it was destined for that thing, but it wound up being there. So they just kept shooting.
It's such an accomplishment, and I feel like in regards to a just a document that demonstrates the work that you guys are doing at Pro8mm. I mean, that show is just a walking example. And you talk about how it's the Super 8's been used on everything from, Mariah Carey's All I Want for Christmas Is You music video 94 to it's featured in Oppenheimer, which is being, projected on 70 millimeter film in an IMAX when it's finally done. Like it's just showing up everywhere, at least in these Hollywood productions, in 2023, 2024, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, I think it's because it's got its own value somehow. And we do a lot of work, that it's fun to talk about the celebrity stuff and things like that, but a lot more of it has to do with just more average people who are just interested in fact, I have to say, of all the things that I, experienced, one of the greatest experiences is when somebody will write on their work order, as I'm scanning it, this is my first time ever like holding a camera, right? And you're putting it on and you're actually like a little nervous for them because you're like, oh, it's their first time. Like, is this going to be like, and then more often than not, it's which is incredible to me when you're talking about what we're talking about. It's a 50-year-old camera, that somebody's picked up. It hasn't been used maybe in 20 years. That they're putting this old technology in, and it's that old. Just the fact that it might work is like beyond anything. And then when you see these images that are unique and just carry the day, like we do a lot of wedding stuff because it just emotionally just carries the moment of a wedding in such a way that's just so elegant and kind of classy and romantic and like I don't know, you just see a picture of a bride and the flow of it and you look at the video and you're like, yeah, it's just like everything else that happened that week. And then you look at the Super 8 of it, you're like, oh wow, this was like an occasion. It was something, that stood out. And you get that feeling off of somebody who never picked up a camera before. It's like, wow, that speaks to me of how powerful the medium itself is. All by itself, it's doing the work. You're pulling the trigger and you're presenting it with something, but the heavy lifting here creatively is going on actually with the chemical process, the way the film is being exposed to light and stuff like that, to result in this classic looking image of something. That's just so powerful to me, in terms of something that we should maintain and preserve and have for the next generations. And I think Super 8 will go on because of that, literally forever, because how few things can do that kind of thing where it can just do its thing. You didn't study it in school, you didn't, and it presents you with this amazing new version of life. Like that's pretty powerful. I mean, I'm gonna be there to like support it in whatever way it can. And then of course you get people who then want to take it further and and work with it from that standpoint. But it's got the on its own, it can kind of do it all by itself. With you don't have to put any kind of ASC skilled driver behind it. You could take your average person who wants to create interesting, wedding videography or, passionate stuff about their family and their vacation trips. And, like it just stands out like, wow, this was our trip to Yosemite, like I got a million videos of it, but nothing compares to what this particular thing did, on that trip.
Amazing. I'm really happy you brought up the sort of amateur nature of it because I have just a few more questions for you, and one relates to that. But I remember in film school I'd get all these Super 8 cameras and I'd go to the thrift store and I'd try to find the next one. I remember finding the first one that I got to own that had an intervalometer. And for people who are like, what on earth is an intervalometer? That's the Super 8 traditional film way of saying that I could do a time lapse where I could say every so many seconds or minutes or whatever it would take a frame, and I filmed Actually, funny enough, I was in Massachusetts and I filmed a sunset on Kodachrome, and to me, that still is the one of the most remarkable pieces of art I've ever made. Was
Right.
just being able to capture the sunset and knowing this is the angle that I want and this is how it's going to work, and I'm engineering this thing, and then it shoots, and I get it back in 6 weeks or whatever it was because I
Yeah.
delayed shipping it and whatever, and just having that moment of seeing this, projected on a white wall, with my little projector was like, I made something amazing, and no one will ever be able to capture that sunset in the same way that this strip of Kodachrome did.
Right. Yeah.
So
It's
in Sorry.
no, it's kind of perfect in that way.
It really is, and I think I've heard you talk in interviews about the fact that Super 8 sales and what you guys are doing. It seems like the quantity of film that is getting produced and shot seems to be about the same as it has been. But you're seeing a lot of new people entering the space where they're doing a lot of interesting things with a roll here, as opposed to shooting forever. And I'm curious about two things. One is, well, I'll just break them up into separate things. First is in regards to what Pro8mm is doing right now. What are the sort of main cornerstones of your company? What are the main services that you guys offer? And, how do people gain access to that?
Well, in order to do it, you need the four pillars. You need the camera, the film, the processing, and the scanning. It's like without those four posts, you don't have the medium. So there's got to be some nature of support to cameras. So we're doing a lot with that, more and more all the time in terms of like rebuilding, repairing, because there's no new. Um, but it doesn't really phase us that doesn't exist because the quantity of Super 8 cameras that were manufactured over the years, I calculated one time at like 60 million or something like that. It's like the the quantity of cameras that is out there is just ginormous compared to the number of people that are actually going to want to pursue something creatively, you know, um, with the medium is never going to approach those kind of numbers. So there's plenty of cameras, I feel like, for the next decade, or the next century, really, to support. Yeah, but there's issues. You got to try to figure out why a lot of them are all failing in one regard, and maybe there's a repair thing, or we do a lot of take two cameras and make one camera out of it. You take the good out of, because some of them, just so there's a fair amount of attention to the camera kind of world and why it's, what's happening there. Then the film, it's pretty stable right now. We kind of we still manufacture our own film, but Kodak decided to make the film. And quite honestly, we really weren't able to keep up with the demand. We would have had to invest a lot more in manufacturing to do that. Kodak had all the manufacturing to do it. They decided they wanted to do it. As long as they do it reasonably, let them have at it. They already got the machinery to do it. Every so often, we gotta, they'll come up short. We have to fire back up and do something. So we feel secure. I mean, in my early years, it did feel like I was dependent on their existence too much, and so I really felt I needed to be secure with, if they didn't exist, I could still exist, which I feel positive about. As long as film itself exists, I can always make something into Super 8. I got the capacity to do that. So I feel pretty good about the film thing. But it's kind of stable, in terms of what's happening in film. Nothing's really, they're not coming out with new stock next year or something like that. The processing, their machines, they break. You got to stay up on them and stuff like that. But we're doing good there. And then the scanning's, big part of it, moving it from film to digital. There's a lot of options today for scanning. There's home scanning, there's put it all in a box and send it to some guy scanning. There's a lot of different options in scanning. I still think we have, some of the best ways of doing it, but it's a highly competitive kind of world out there. the other stuff that I think we just kind of pushing forward is just logistics kind of thing. Like as we shifted from, like you say, a smaller number of people shooting more film to a larger number of people shooting less film, it's created kind of a logistics nightmare. You know, when you're handling 100 different people's one roll of film, um, you gotta you got to approach it different. We had a little bit more of a personal approach to customers and new people's names and stuff like that at one point. Today, it's thankfully we have a kind of AI system called Sprocket, where you can integrate into an app and you can put in what you want done, and you don't really have to we don't have to tie up a lot of time with personal relationships on which we would love to do, but at the numbers it's impossible to do. So in order to do what we do now, we rely on that kind of logistic support of like an AI program like Sprocket, which basically forces you to make the decisions you have to make to get your film processed and scanned and returned to you. And we have online capacity to send it over the internet and stuff like that. So some of those things are where we have to put a bunch of time to make the future viable for everyone and keep the cost down. So we really, I don't think we've raised the price of film processing scanning in the last 5 or 7 years, because we've developed efficiencies and we've moved some things. Like for example, we always color corrected everyone's footage before we, as a function of the scanning. So they always got perfectly color corrected images back. But today we do something called log scanning. So we scan like a flat pass of their footage, which is called a log, like raw and still photography. And then you take it into, DaVinci or Final Cut or whatever edit program and you do the color correcting. And that shifts the cost from you having to pay a service for that, so you can do it yourself. As a consequence, a lot of people use the logs, as so you get these looks and you're like, wow, they really like that flat look on that jeans commercial. Like, you're not supposed to use the log footage, like as you're supposed to color correct it. But, like the Sprocket and some of that kind of stuff, people just sometimes either don't know or they like it. They just think, oh, that looks kind of cool. Maybe that's what Super 8 is supposed to look like, flat, images, right? So, we working with those kinds of things, to try to keep a large population of people happy, with the kind of service that we've always offered, but being able to do it, with this great number of people. So that's a change.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for your time. I'm just, you've been, you've conquered a lot of topics. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you're kind of curious about, or you want to throw out into the universe before we depart?
I think the universe is going pretty good.
And so, especially in the Super 8 world with you,
Yep.
Overseeing it. For anybody who's interested in Pro 8mm, Phil, where should they hunt you down?
On the web is good. There's hundreds of videos and stuff up there as well through YouTube and Instagram and all that kinds of stuff. You can always pick up the phone, sometimes people do that. Our info at Pro8, it's pretty easy to find. And I hope that it's pretty easy to navigate, yourself, through the process so that you can experience it, on your own and get where you want to get with it, with our help.
Awesome. Well, Phil, thanks for all you're doing. Thanks for your time.
All right.
I hope you have a great sunny day on the West Coast.
Oh, California, it's always sunny.
All right. Have a good one, Phil. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye now.
All right. In the immortal words of Phil Vigeant, just remember, nobody starts out great. It's okay to have a learning process in regards to your creative arts, whether it relates to Super 8 or otherwise. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Phil Vigeant. I love hearing from people that find an opportunity and then run with it. I mean, to sit there and devote yourself to an 8mm frame for His company's been around for 50 years. He's been around for most of that. I mean, that's a pretty significant accomplishment and a significant obsession. And I absolutely love it. If you're interested in shooting Super 8 film, if this made you want to pick up a camera and make your own movies, don't hesitate. Please go check out Pro8mm. Go on YouTube and look up videos how to shoot Super 8. Figure out what cameras get you excited. Figure out what sort of features you want. It's a pretty cool hobby, and I know that in 2024, where we're currently all living, I'm going to be shooting quite a few rolls, and I'm excited to see what I make. Speaking of making things, our next guest coming in just 2 weeks on January 31st is Jenny Johnson. Jenny is the owner of Isotope Ice Cream and Desserts and is well known around Western New York for her vegan baking. So if you ever had Misfit donuts or you had desserts from the Owl House, you're familiar with her work and your stomach was probably all the happier for it. In that conversation, we're going to talk about successes, failures, just moving forward and following your passions, and most importantly, the research and development of vegan baking. So if you are interested, please tune in for episode 14 on January 31st, wherever you can find your podcasts. And as always, please, if you like what you hear, write a review, share it with people around you, post it on social media, send smoke signals so that people know that Meditations with Ryan Zlomek is bringing you joy. My hope is that the right people can hear these stories, and the only way it's going to happen is if you find the people. We all do what we can to sort of share this narrative, and you're a part of the process, and I'm just so thankful you're here, and I really appreciate your support. Additionally, you can find The World of Ryan Zlomek on Facebook and Instagram. Don't be a stranger. Email meditations@ryanzlomek.com if you have any questions or are interested in sponsorship. Otherwise, have a wonderful rest of your day. I'll be back in 2 weeks. Thanks for everything.